welcome to the table here at the roundtable discussion for the Asian American Christian Collaborative. We have pastors and leaders who are able to draw from their experiences, education, and expertise to discuss questions and issues that impact the Asian American Christian community and the church. So at the table is a production of the AACC, the Asian American Christian Collaborative. Today, this panel will be talking about finances. So what I would love for us to go around and have each member introduce themselves for about 30 seconds.
Hi, I'm Vivian Long. I'm Executive Director of the Long Family Foundation and excited to be talking with all of you today.
My name is Jeff Yim. I'm a former college pastor and I've done work in the nonprofit sector, most recently in refugee resettlement. Currently, I'm a financial advisor and I love what I do.
My name is Kevin Hayashida. I am pastor at Crossroads Community Church. We started this church about 25 years ago. Previous to that, I was in the marketplace and worked as an engineer for about 3 years.
Fantastic. And I am Dr. Alan Ye. I'm a professor of Intercultural Studies and Missiology at Biola University in La Mirada, California. All right. Well, I'm delighted to host this conversation with all of you. Here's the first question. What does flourishing mean to you? Any of you can start.
I think financial flourishing has at least 3 components to it. First, I think someone who is financially flourishing is more or less free from the special anxiety that attaches to money matters and personal finance. I think secondly, a financial flourishing person is one who is generous with their money. And finally, I think someone who's financially flourishing is not only generous, but the generosity is actually doing real good in the community. It's very possible to be generous and to produce unintentional harm in the very communities that we're trying to support. And it's very easy to be generous and your generosity be maybe not harmful, but certainly ineffective. But I think someone who's flourishing is someone whose generosity is sensible, is intelligent, and it's making an actually good difference in the world.
Thank you very much.
I'd agree with a lot of what Jeff was saying there. And I think that as you are financially flourishing, that you are a good steward of all the resources that God has given you. So it's not only for yourself, but you want to be able to be a blessing to other people. So it would be someone who is a good steward of their resources, but also is using that to play a part in God's big plan and to bless others as well, and consequently would not have that anxiety, and they would have a certain freedom and joy even when it comes to their finances.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when I thought of this word flourishing, I really felt like part of it was peace. And, you know, flourishing can apply to so many different aspects, and I know other panels are going to talk about that, but, you know, flourishing has this element of, like, I think really being peaceful with where God has put you. And I think as it pertains to finances, across the world, a lot of us are not in control of that all of the time, right? And so I think when I was thinking about this question, like, can you flourish despite your circumstances, whatever those circumstances are that God has given to you? And so I think freedom is a piece of it. I think that stewardship is a huge piece of it, but I think it goes back to listening, really. Are you in tune with what God is telling you to do with what He's given you?
Wonderful. And hear many resonances of themes between the 3 of you. The next question is, what, in your opinion, does it entail to thrive or flourish in your financial life? How would you distinguish financial flourishing from wealth or financial stability? Good nuances.
I can answer this question. So in my job, my profession is that I'm executive director of the Long Family Foundation. And so, along with that comes with some implication that we have the resources to have a family foundation, which is an incredible blessing. And I think one thing I'm so grateful for is that when my parents tell the story about how they established the foundation over 30 years ago, they really felt this responsibility and this obedience to God to establish this vehicle for generosity. And they just wanted to give back, I think, in a way that they felt they had been given to in their lives. And so I think the story of this financial story for them of coming from really abject poverty to a place where they could give so generously is, I think, at the root of everything we do in the foundation. But as a next gen inheritor, if you will, of that blessing, it's a little bit of a different relationship because I didn't create the wealth. And I'm actively in a role where I am not creating wealth. I'm giving that wealth away. And so it's something that I really wrestle with, this idea of flourishing, this idea of freedom, this idea of stewardship and contributing, because it's not so simple as I've used the resources that God has given me, the talents that He's given me to produce something. It's a little bit different in that I'm using the talents and the resources that God and my family have provided for me to actually pour that into somebody else. And so, I think when it comes to this idea of flourishing, this idea of wealth, and this idea of peace, how do I come to terms with this idea that God has given me so much, He's put me in this position, and now I need to make sure I'm not irresponsible with it? That is something that I think weighs heavily on me. And like the anxiety that comes along with that, I'm like, is that flourishing? But the tension, I feel, is part of this journey that God has me on. It's not as simple as, well, you've made the money and now it's your turn to be generous. It's much more, it's much more of I almost feel like the journey is the destination, if that makes sense, in that wrestling with these resources that God has given to me, trying to be a good steward of it, is where He wants me to be. And I almost think that the peace that I'm looking for is only can come with this idea of, am I doing this really right for Him?
Right. And I think we can all identify with that as just children of God. Everything that we have is from the Lord. Yeah. And so it's not really our money. We're just, managing it and stewarding it the best we can from the person who gave it to us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you make a distinction between flourishing and then perhaps wealth, because if Jesus' words are true for everyone, it means that you can flourish wherever you are. Some people will have more, some people will have less. And I remember in times in my life, especially when we were getting started in ministry, that we didn't really have that much. And we had a commitment to still be good stewards, to tithe, to be generous as best as we could. And as God has blessed that, we continue to grow in that area. But I think that it's not that at least financial flourishing is not contingent on having a bunch of money, but it's really a perspective. And if your heart is growing and that you're able to be generous and you're able to take care of your own immediate needs, that you can flourish wherever you are.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's interesting, this distinction between, on the one hand, wealth and stability, and on the other hand, flourishing. Because it's very easy to think that having wealth and being stable just is flourishing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of us have wealth and stability as the ultimate goal. But maybe that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe that's just a goal. Or maybe wealth and stability is a means to a further goal, which is flourishing. And so to repeatedly ask the question, what is flourishing in my situation? I think that is a wonderful exercise of personal reflection and growth, and I think that's kind of what we're here today to do, is figure that out together as a community. And so what is that extra something that constitutes flourishing? Is it generosity? Is it radical generosity? Is it looking past myself and my needs to my family, my extended family, my church community, and so forth? So I'd be interested in hearing everyone's thoughts as we keep talking about it.
Absolutely, and I do think that we often put the cart before the horse, right? We think that the money is the end goal, this is the means to the end goal, yeah.
And Jeff, I think another thing that you said that struck me is that it's changing, right? It's not consistent all the time because your circumstances change. And so to constantly be asking the question, to constantly be reevaluating, I think is a really important part of this idea of flourishing.
Yeah, and I also want to be careful in that we might be speaking from kind of a middle class, privileged perspective. And when we think about those in our community that are less resourced, we shouldn't say to them, oh, don't pursue wealth or something like that. That's not the message. But I think wherever we are in our resourcing, nonetheless, there's still something extra that goes into what flourishing is. And it's not just wealth, it's something more. And so I think it's important to try to figure that out together.
Absolutely. I'm going to actually ask the next two questions together because I do think that they fit together. How might cultural expectations inform your own view of financial flourishing and responsibility? And coupled with this, there are stereotypes that come along with being Asian American, such as the model minority myth, which portray Asian Americans as wealthy and successful. So how might these stereotypes affect our understanding of financial flourishing and create unrealistic expectations? And how might we address and overcome these perceptions? So again, that's a lot of questions, but how do your cultural expectations inform your own view of financial flourishing and responsibility? And then the stereotypes that come from being Asian American, how do these affect our understanding of financial flourishing and create unrealistic expectations? And how do we address and overcome these?
I think I can answer it, at least from my own experience. So I'm not always aware of my cultural values and expectations. It's only sometimes when I'm in another environment that I realize that, oh, am I responding this way because of the way I was raised or my culture or something? So it's helpful to take a step back and take a look at that. For example, when I grew up in church, our community was pretty much like middle class to upper middle class. And I think the unspoken expectation was that everybody would go to college, everybody would graduate, everybody would get a pretty decent job, like be an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor. And nobody told me this is what you had to do, but somehow it was just there. So, and as it happened, most of my friends took that path. So I think part of my unspoken expectation is that's what I would do. I'd be successful enough to, have a house and have a family and take trips and do all of those kinds of things. But it's a good question is to ask, is that necessary? Is that, can you be a flourishing person without doing all those things? And I think you can. And one of the ways that I've tried to adapt to that is when we are raising our own kids, is that an expectation that I'm putting on them, whether it's spoken or unspoken, like you have to go to college, you got to do all these things. And we've tried to say, no, if God has another path for you, if you're gonna go someplace and not make that much money, that's going to be that's okay with us. But I do realize, even in my extended family, there are expectations that come from other family members or maybe even the rest of the community. So it's something that I must always be aware of, and I realize it has influenced me more than I care to, or than I've always imagined.
Yeah, I think one thing that struck me about what you said is flourishing as it pertains to how other people see you, or what the expectations of your community or what's around you, as opposed to, is flourishing truly something that only you can define for yourself, or is that something between you and God? And I think finance is an example of something that actually has a lot more like external visibility, if you will, right? Like you can kind of gauge, or you can surmise like where somebody is financially based on the decisions they make, what kind of car they drive, what kind of house they have. But it isn't any sort of indication of that flourishing internally. And so I think when we think about like Asian Americans and expectations within the community, that's one piece of it. And then I think also about this kind of cultural element of responsibility that I think is very deep in the Asian American community, and certainly like in Asian American families, personal responsibility. And I think for those of us who came from an immigrant background, I think, when I talk to my parents, I think they wanted to work so hard and build as much financial stability as they could so that their three daughters, weren't in a place of vulnerability. And so that was kind of like the first step, make sure we're not vulnerable. And then I think the next part is, well, then you're responsible. And I think that's where I think a lot of Asian Americans kind of focus on, is this element of responsibility. You're responsible for yourself, you're responsible for your family, and then third, you're responsible for your community. Mm-hmm. And the finances are an extension of that. But as I've been working in this opportunity to be generous philanthropically through the foundation, our foundation is relatively small. We're certainly not a Gates Foundation, a California endowment, but we see the need just the same. And I think it's been very humbling to say we have a responsibility and we can't do this by any stretch of the means by ourselves. We're completely dependent on God, but we're also dependent on, the generosity of others to help the organizations that we care about, because the Long Family Foundation cannot bear the weight of all of these really important organizations, all of these really important issues. And so that has kind of flipped this idea of individual responsibility on its head. When we think about our philanthropic giving, we have to do it in partnership with other people. And I think that's the way God also intends for us to see our resources. They are ultimately all His, and we have to work with each other to glorify Him to the best of our abilities.
That's good. I'll say something about the model minority myth, just to attack that directly. I think the most important thing when it comes to anything related to the model minority is for us to continue to educate our own community on it, especially our younger generation, on exactly why it's a myth, and a harmful one at that. And when we begin to undermine that model minority myth, all the expectations that are attached to it, whether they be financial or personal or whatever, kind of fall away. So I would just stress that those of us in leadership, those of us who have a big platform or a small platform, it doesn't matter, just continue to educate our community on the model minority myth. And I do think it is harmful. Take, for example, the myth of, it comes out of the model minority myth, this view that Asian Americans are financially successful. If you dig into the model minority myth more, you'll see that the reason that Asian Americans are successful is because they work hard and they're just worker bees. They're not leaders, they're workers. And then if we internalize that, then what does that say about our income potential? If we're not leaders, if we're middle management at best. And if there's a ceiling above us that's impenetrable, what does that say about our earning potential? And I think that that's kind of, and it disproportionately affects Asian American women, I think. But I think that kind of self-concept, that I'm limited, that there's this impenetrable ceiling above me, that I can't earn much more than that, that can be very destructive. And so when we abandon the model minority myth entirely, and we insist on our own agency, our own self-determination, then the sky's the limit. And I think that's what I want for my children and our community, is to exercise our own self-determination, our own agency, come up with our own concept of who we are as a community.
Thank you so much. If I might speak into this a little bit as well, the model minority myth, I think what is hard about it is there are elements of truth within it, but it is not a universally applicable thing across the board. The Asian American community is so diverse, and when you think about the different ethnicities and different cultures involved, and the average wealth within each different ethnic group varies wildly. For example, Indian Americans are by far the most wealthy group in America, okay? Far above white Americans, far above any other Asian Americans. But if you go to India, they're not all like that, right? And part of it has to do with like immigration patterns and the US only allowing in, highly educated, highly skilled workers of a certain, and so that sort of skews the data a certain way. And then you look at the Hmong American community, who are quite poor in many respects, and then everything in between. And so I think we need to take those things into account. And then Jane Hyun, she's a friend of mine, but she wrote a book called Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling. And I think that's also important to know, that there are cultural values in the workplace that may impact how one rises within the workplace. But Jeff, I totally hear you, like, you need to not let those things restrict you, but also recognizing that there are some systemic things that are at play. For example, Asian Americans tend to, can be often within the workplace compliant, listen to their bosses, work collaboratively in harmony with others, don't be disruptive. How is this interpreted in a white workspace who values independent thinking, creativity, outspokenness, initiative? They may look at the Asians and say, boy, you're just passive and, you don't seem to care. Well, that's a complete misreading of what the Asians are doing. They're trying to be compliant, work in harmony with others, and not put themselves ahead of everyone else, and listen to their boss and do, So you have these competing sets of values, both of which are good, but sometimes can work at odds with some of the Asian American community. But at the same time, Asian Americans also have great capacity and potential, which also seems to, it's like even overcoming those hurdles, right? So, and then even the wealth generation differs from first generation to second generation, third generation. Sometimes the immigrants come in and they're working at the laundromat, they're washing dishes. They're second generation, they go to Harvard and become lawyers and medical doctors, right? And the third generation kind of sort of averages out with the rest of America, right? And so even within generations, you have totally different wealth distributions. And so I think it's important to bear all that in mind. And as our audience listens to this and say, yeah, there's not a homogeneity here, right? And so all right, thank you so much. Well, I just
wanted to say one more thing about cultural expectations.
Yes.
As it pertains to flourishing. I think in a lot of Asian American contexts, not all, because we are so diverse, but there is an expectation of multi-generational living in a single home. And if that's the case, then people need to financially plan for that. And so flourishing will then necessarily involve financial planning for multi-generational living in a single home. There might be other contexts where, like my parents who are part of that post-1965 Immigration Act generation, they came to the country with not much resources, and so they definitely have a scarcity mentality, and they are people who are generous nonetheless, and so with whatever wealth they've built, they want to pass down. And so if you have a scarcity mentality and you want to bless your family with whatever you have, then flourishing for my parents needs to involve that kind of generosity toward one's family. So I think whatever cultural expectation there might be needs to be linked into what counts as a successful, flourishing financial life.
I love that. So many of you have touched on this, that flourishing is not just about the individual, it is about the community, right? And I think that's something that the Asian American culture can lend to the conversation, right? Instead of just individualism. So as this is the Asian American Christian Collaborative, I want to turn our thoughts to the Lord. And because God clearly provides, He calls us to be generous towards others. How do we navigate the tension between a health and wealth prosperity gospel and also a gospel that is good news to the poor?
Well, if I understand the health and wealth gospel, it's like, if I give this much, then God kind of owes me something. And that's that's not a biblical concept. I mean, ultimately that's being selfish. It's like, I'm going to be generous just so I can get a whole bunch in return. I think there are some principles that we've been talking about that if you work hard, if you are responsible, there's a pretty good chance that you will be successful. I mean, there's some things that are outside of our control, so you can't guarantee that. But I think that our motivation for all these things ultimately is to serve God and honor God, and it's not, what do I get out of this? I mean, having said that, I think God wants us to enjoy the things that He has blessed us with, so that if we have peace that we are actually being generous and being good stewards. In the church world, we ask people to be good stewards and perhaps tithe or have some benchmark of generosity, just as something to aim for, and that if we are able to do that, that we can have the freedom to indulge certain things for ourselves. We don't have to live as paupers or anything. But if we are good stewards, if there's a standard that if we believe that we're being obedient in our generosity, then I think we should also have the freedom to enjoy what God has blessed us with.
Amen. Thanks for putting on your theologian hat, Pastor.
Anytime.
Yeah, I think one thing I would also say that like God has really convicted me of is this idea of mammon, and Pastor Kevin can probably speak much more eloquently and deeply about it than I will. But I think mammon. What strikes me is that mammon is the love of money, and I think you don't have to be wealthy or poor. You can mammon can be in your heart either way, right? And I think like mammon becoming that idol is dangerous. I think the Bible warns us about it many times. And so I think it comes back to kind of like this Asian identity of, where does money or where does finances sit in our lives? Where does it sit in our hearts? And whether God has given you a lot, or God has given you what you feel like maybe is not a lot, I think the questioning of like, where's your heart position toward that, is something to always keep in check. And, I heard this really powerful sermon about mammon, and essentially, it's this love that overpowers your ability to see what God is providing for you in the context of like everything else in your life. And I think if that is the lens in which you're kind of going through life and looking at God and what He has provided or hasn't provided, I think that's something that, just is a challenge for us. And I think it plagues Asians, it plagues, I think, a lot of Western society.
This makes me think of something which I heard this survey was done. It's about the link between wealth and happiness and relativism. So the survey was done. They asked people, would you rather make $75,000 a year and have all your friends make $50,000? Or would you rather make $100,000 a year and have all your friends make $200,000? You know what almost everyone said? They would rather make 75 and have all their friends make 50, because then they'd be the richest of all their friends, right? And it's so interesting how wealth plays out. People always think, if I just make this much, I'll be happy. And it's very relativistic, and it's about comparisons, and social media exacerbates this. And people think they're, I've only had this much, or I'm so unhappy and because I only make this much. And I mean, those numbers are very fluid. Yeah.
Can I,
Yeah.
Vivian, you made the comment about mammon. I think that's a great comment. Jesus said you can't serve God, and sometimes it's translated as money, but it actually is mammon.
Yes.
And like when we think of money, we just think of something that is kind of neutral. But mammon actually has, I think, a spiritual connotation. Like there's almost a dark spiritual force behind that. And the guy I know who's at least the wealthiest guy I know, who's got, way more than I'll ever have. But he was telling me, just in his world of high finance, that he has seen that love of money or the love of mammon just totally corrupt so many people. And it is something that's powerful, and that's something that's dangerous. And even talking about spending on ourselves and indulging things, that there always is the temptation that we're rationalizing that, okay, I'm allowed to do this or do that and indulge myself, and I still stand by what I said, but it's very that's why we need a community of people who can also help us give some objectivity to all these areas in our lives, not just finances, but every area of our discipleship.
Yeah. I think one way to express maybe what's being said is that the vast majority of Christians will find it morally acceptable and also acceptable from a Christian point of view to strike a balance between, on the one hand, outright materialism, and on the other hand, some kind of extreme asceticism. And in that intermediate state, which is very hard to specify, actually, between materialism and asceticism, that's where a lot of the substance of Christian living gets played out. That's when we integrate our faith and our finances and our relationships, and all of that happens in that hard to specify middle ground. And I think in that middle ground, there's a few sensible things to keep in mind when it's related to finances. For example, not to make an idol of finances, not to abuse people in the pursuit of wealth, not to abuse the land, the earth, in the pursuit of wealth, to be generous, to be willing to share. And so I think that's kind of how we grow as Christians, is to take on those questions and to take on those concerns and figure things out with our community
Thank you so much. These are really great answers. And I have two more questions for you all. The gap between the haves and have-nots are increasing exponentially. What role, if any, do you think that Christians have in addressing this widening gap?
This is something that bothers me quite a bit about my own life. And I think any morally conscious person feels the tension of this as well, in the sense that we know we don't have to read Peter Singer or Ron Sider or anybody. We know that those of us who have been blessed stare in the face of both our blessing and those that don't have as much. And we sense this call to action. And I think it's hard to ignore. It's hard to ignore, and it's hard to set aside. And I think that God doesn't want us to set it aside. Mm-hmm. I think God wants us to look straight at it. Mm-hmm. And so I've always had it as a goal to live simply. So it's not just how much money you give away, but it's in your consumption habits. And when you live a simple life, that can be a basis for being generous financially. So I think that's important. I think it's important to find a underserved community in your neighborhood, in your region that you care about, that matters to you. And not to approach that community in any kind of paternalistic way, but just with humility. Think about partnering with a nonprofit that is already serving that community, a nonprofit that has adopted best practices, that has data-driven approaches, and just to come alongside that nonprofit and say, what can I do? Talk to their volunteer coordinator. What kind of volunteer hours can I pour into the nonprofit? What kind of in-kind donations can I bring? And especially, what kind of cash donations can I bring? And then just making that kind of giving a regular rhythm in your life, and have your kids join you, and have people in your community join into that kind of giving. So that sort of activity, when done well and when pervasive, that will begin to shrink the gap of income inequality and the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And also to have a global perspective, thinking international development, and how can we help not only those in our neighborhood, but just those internationally that are less resourced than we are.
It's beautiful. Very practical too.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's troubling. And I think it is something that God doesn't want us to look away from. I think one area that I think the word I think of is proximity, right? Like, how do we not grow that gap, to your point? And I think so many Asian Americans, like the goal is ascending, if you will. Like, it's this pursuit of achievement or like leveling up, in whatever way. Either you go like to the next best school or you get the next promotion. And I think finances is a very logical and a very like black and white way to say I'm leveling up, right? Like, is my bank account growing? And I think that, like, does that come at a price? I think, Jeff, you really put it beautifully. Like, what is the counterbalance to that? And what are the guardrails, I think, that like we have in our lives to live simply, or I think to remain obedient to God? I think like that's the question, is how do we remain obedient to God? And I think for some people that is having those close relationships, giving generously. I think for most people that is like the accountability that we feel God has given to us. And I think like also for some people it's a lot more on the social justice side. I mean, you could talk about reparations. You can talk about ways that I think like there's been financial injustice to the Asian American community themselves, right? And like, do we support that even if we feel like we don't, it's not our battle to fight? I think those are ways that like the haves and have not is not just a have or have not financially. It's also this have or have not in terms of justice, accessibility. And so I think, do we listen when God is telling us, is opening our heart, is breaking our heart when we see those things? And how do we step in with whatever resources he's given us to I think, come alongside people who don't have, who could benefit from what we bring?
We're talking about, if we're talking about the gap, and I'm not an economist, but when a culture is flourishing and some people are getting richer, it seems like there's just going to be a gap no matter what. And I think the concern is really what are the least, what is this level of the least of these? So in my mind, I'm not as concerned about the gap as much as I am at where is this level that there are people who are under-resourced and underprivileged. And I know that that is on Jesus' heart. So regardless of anything, how much certain people flourish or not, or are financially successful, that if we're following Christ, that we can never forget the people who are under-resourced. And I think Jeff was saying too that maybe one of the best ways to not forget that is actually to be involved, is to rub elbows with people who are in a different life situation. And for my own family, and this is hard, especially in a place like Orange County where you don't see too much of people who are under-resourced, but in the chances that we have had to go either to another part of the world or another part of the country where people have less, is helpful for me, and I know it's helpful for when we were raising our kids, going on mission trips, doing other things, to see that, you know, everyone in the world does not live like we do. There's a lot of people who have less, and it is on the heart of God to take care of these people to the best that we can. So I think we should always be involved, and the church should be involved.
All right, wonderful. All right, the closing question. In John 10:10, Jesus says, "I've come to give life abundant." Okay. How do we interpret that for our finances to not just survive but thrive? And I know you've all given such wonderful perspectives, but if you could encapsulate that in a final statement, Jesus wants us to have life abundant. So what does that look like to not just survive but to thrive? To have a flourishing life of abundance in our finances.
As I was reading the passage and trying to prepare for this, one part of John 10 struck me at the beginning, which was that, you know, Jesus is likening himself to the shepherd, and he's saying that the sheep who are familiar with his voice will follow him. And so I think it's, for me, I think living abundantly really goes back to this idea that like we need to be familiar with Jesus's voice as we're trying to make these decisions, and we're trying to figure out, you know, finances, right? Like, and then I think he says like the thief will lead them astray. And there's so many voices that are telling us what we should do with our money, right? Like, I mean, the whole economy is like telling us how we should spend, you know, what is worthwhile to spend, what we should be, what's aspirational. But if we just continue, I think, to like really be disciplined about hearing God's voice and that being what we're most familiar with, what we're most attuned with, I think that will lead to flourishing.
I think one way to approach this is to do whatever we can to reinforce the proper concept of God as himself generous, as provider, as father who's going to take care of his children, and not to think of ourselves as survivors, as orphans, but instead to think of ourselves as sons and daughters of the Most High King. I think that's crucially important. And I also think it's important, if I can just put on my financial advisor hat for a second, to plan, to learn the basic categories of wealth protection, wealth accumulation, and wealth preservation. And when we are a little bit more confident in what we have and where we're going financially, then I think we can have more confidence in our generosity. And again, generosity being key to a financially flourishing life.
You mentioned John 10:10, Ellen, and I love that. I love that passage. And when I think about Jesus and his audience that he was speaking to, not just in John, but throughout his ministry, I imagine that he was speaking to people who, many of them were poor. They were just stuck in some social system and some place that they would never get out of. And yet, even to them, he could say that he had come to bring life and to bring life abundantly. So taking from that living a life of abundance is not related necessarily to your finances and having a lot, because he was speaking to people who just wouldn't. But there is some quality of life to live in the kingdom, which I think it means to live with the presence of God and with the power of the Spirit that transcends any type of circumstance that you're in, that you can still have a joyful, content life. That is what Jesus came to do. I mean, having said that, that when we are, as Jeff was saying, like following after the example of Jesus and living as a generous life like he did, following his example, that Jesus leveraged his whatever resources he had for people who had nothing, that when we are following his example, we would do the same thing, that we would leverage the resources that we have, whether it's financial or time or ability, for people who have less than we do. So when we're actually doing that we will be following his example, and that will lead us to that type of flourishing, abundant life. And that is available to everyone, regardless of where you find yourself right now. That offer is good for us all.
That's so good, Pastor. Yeah, I've always thought about when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," and it took me a while to figure out that they're blessed not because they're poor, because poverty is not a good thing, but they're blessed because they're loved by God. So the blessing is in God's kingdom and God's love and his generosity for them. And it's that same love and generosity for those of us who have more. And so you're right. In some ways, the true blessing of our faith is in that companionship, the power and presence of God and his Spirit. And that's available to all of us. So that's the encouraging thing about our faith, is that it's given freely to all.
Wow, this has been some really good stuff. This has been a very rich, pun intended, conversation that we have had about finances. So as we close here at the table, we want to especially thank our panelists, and the conversation here was such a blessing, and I hope it is a blessing to you as well. If you found this helpful, we encourage you to also share it with others, and make sure you sign up for the AACC newsletter at the website, the Asian American Christian Collaborative.com or aachristcollab.com. You can also follow AACC on socials at AAChristCollab, and The AACC is a volunteer-driven and donor-supported, so if you would like to support the ministry, we encourage you to give online. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.